So welcome to our session, Developing Open Educators Through K-12 and Higher Ed Connections. You can follow along with our slides at tinyurl.com/K12-higher ed. And I'm here with two colleagues, Kim and Jen, who will introduce themselves when they start to speak. I'm Amy Hofer, Statewide Open Education Program Director with Open Oregon Educational Resources. And thanks again for your patience with this hybrid conference thing that we're doing here. So our big news is that we have new funding from the Hewlett Foundation to offer support for pre-service faculty to redesign their courses using open educational resources with an equity lens. And our goal is that we're going to prepare future K-12 teachers to be open educators who can leverage open practices to customize their curriculum and better represent and support their students in the classroom while staying aligned with Oregon standards. So a little bit of background, this is a multi-layered topic to talk about. So the words that we're using, pre-service faculty are instructors at Oregon's community colleges and universities. Pre-service teachers are the students of pre-service faculty. So in other words, they are future K-12 teachers. And practitioner teachers are current classroom teachers. Back in 2020 to 2021, we had a working group that came out of our statewide OER steering committee that created an explainer about overlap and areas of similarity between K-12 and higher ed for OER. I'm a higher ed person. K-12 is such a different environment that I am like the ideal audience for an explainer, right? So, we looked at some similarities and differences in those two environments. And one really exciting area of overlap that we identified is these teacher training programs. So that is the focus of our grant project. And our idea is that pre-service teacher training programs can adopt OER and use open education practices with an equity lens, and also train future teachers to become open educators when they enter the classroom. And, even before this working group was spun up, probably in like the first year that I was in my position, a former colleague at Portland State, Bob Schroeder, said, "Hey, Amy, why don't you work with graduate schools of ed?" And I was like, that's such a good idea. I'm going to write that on my whiteboard. And there it stayed for a really long time on my back burner. And maybe it's on your back burner too. So as the conference theme says, maybe for you, it's about time to put this on the front burner. So we're hoping that by sharing our model, you'll have something to adopt and adapt, a starting point to work from. I want to just give you a few brief words about open education and equity and how they're connected in this project, because it is not a given that these two concepts are connected. And to do this, we're using Lambert's framework. And I'm going to go through this very briefly. We've got a citation to her article in our references slides that I really recommend you check out, because that you can go very deep with this analysis. An example of redistributive justice would be that school districts might have outdated textbook sets that are not allowed out of the classroom because they're too expensive to replace. As by contrast, OER are free online or available in low cost in print. So students can take a copy home. If you have, a more current edition, you can have a new set. If somebody takes a book home and loses it, it's not the end of the world to replace it, right? An example of recognitive justice would be that with all rights reserved curriculum, materials will not include locally relevant examples or represent the students in the room. By contrast, with OER, teachers have permission to make updates. They can customize for alignment with Oregon standards. They can localize to reflect their own students. And then an example of representational justice. In Oregon, we have certain teaching requirements around tribal history, ethnic studies, and genocide and Holocaust history. And so the example would be to invite members of those relevant communities and educators to co-create materials. And a sidebar to that idea is that we would really want to think about whether a Creative Commons license is appropriate for that content, right? If it's your personal history, do you want to have all rights reserved? If it's a tribal history, would a traditional knowledge license be more appropriate, right? So we can also get like pretty nuanced about that. We have done a literature review, and our handout, which is linked in the presentation page in Sketch, also has some of our faves from the lit review highlighted. But the gist of the lit review is, this isn't just like a good idea that we think we had. It's actually building upon the work of other practitioners and academics who are really doing wonderful work publishing and sharing what they've been doing. So some highlights here: less than half of K-12 teachers are aware of OER, but the ones that are most likely to adopt OER as ancillaries or as supplemental materials in K-12, right? So the district or the state picks the curriculum, but there's a lot of room around the edges with ancillaries. Sharing successful examples of OER use can motivate K-12 teachers to adopt. OER can empower K-12 teachers to diversify their curriculum and their pedagogy. And I want to really give a big shout out to our neighbors in Idaho in the Pathways Project, who have just done wonderful work and given really great examples of how pre-service faculty can model and scaffold the use of OER for equity for K-12 teachers. And then also our neighbors in California, the Open for Anti-Racism folks have really highlighted how intentionality is required for an anti-racist course design and open pedagogy. So what our grant is doing, we have done a focus group with practitioner teachers. We really want to make sure we're staying aligned with actual classroom culture and practices and elicit those compelling reasons for pre-service teachers to be learning about OER and equity. We've hosted our first of 2 summer convenings for pre-service faculty, where we're building a community of practice and reaching a shared understanding of the goals of the grant project. We are supporting those pre-service faculty with stipends and with different kinds of outreach during the year as they redesign their courses this year. And we are reporting out, which is what we're doing right now. Thank you for being here. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Kim to continue our presentation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kim Reed. I'm currently a consultant, but spent about 12 years in higher ed, in teaching and learning and OER initiatives, and then spent the last 5 years working for Oregon's largest educator union for K through 14 educators. Yes, is it hard to hear me? Yeah, I am tall. 5'10", if anyone's wondering. I get that question a lot. How tall are you? Okay, so this next part of the presentation, we are reporting on our efforts to gather and amplify and center the voices of K-12 practicing educators. So the first thing we did was convened a focus group of 12 practicing educators, and they came from a variety of disciplines, grade levels, geographic areas in Oregon, ethnic identities, and genders. Most had very little experience or exposure to OER. One of the 12 had used OER a little bit, and another one of the 12 had both created and used OER. We led the focus groups in 2 breakout rooms with these 6 guiding questions. And we also allowed for flexibility for the teachers to take the conversations in other directions, to allow for us as researchers to not know what we didn't know. So in our first question, we asked about what decisions these teachers have control over, and we found that the autonomy in the group was varied quite a bit. We found the most autonomy with the social science educators, and we found that there was very little flexibility and control with language arts teachers. We next asked about what criteria they used when making curriculum decisions, and they responded that they seek materials that are engaging current, relevant, accessible, and visually pleasing. Two opinions that we heard from mostly everyone in the group was that they actively desired materials that feature diverse voices and experiences. They also want materials that make it easy for them to differentiate learning so that they can help students meet outcomes, students at different levels. We then asked them if there are areas where their curriculum falls short in terms of meeting student outcomes. Again, we heard about a lack of representation, a lack of multicultural voices and experiences, and non-English languages. We heard specific call outs in terms of Latinx, LGBTQIA+, and non-American Indigenous voices. We also heard that curriculum can fall short in either being above or below their students' level. We heard that short stories and poetry were in demand but hard to come by, and also a lack in decolonizing curriculum and tribal history resources. We then asked if their curriculum was currently falling short in terms of meeting equity outcomes. And they had pretty much already answered that question in the previous question, which showed that this group of educators had a pretty integrated view of student learning outcomes and equity outcomes. We heard that from one educator that they wanted to see more happening with an equity lens in Oregon on a systems level. We then asked where this group of 12 practicing educators look for resources for materials and curriculum. One of the places that stood out was Teachers Pay Teachers, which, anyone familiar with Teachers Pay Teachers? Okay, yeah, mostly everyone. So, you know, it's a for-profit site where teachers upload their materials and other teachers pay to access them. So while there are the occasional free resources there, they are mostly not free and not licensed with a Creative Commons license. We then had an open-ended question where we learned that incorporating student voices in curriculum was very important. They wanted to see more at the K-5 level that was more in-depth and allowed for more student investigation and exploration. That OER would be more helpful if they were curated into clusters as opposed to standalones, and that teachers need more education on copyright and Creative Commons licensing. So from that group of 12, we invited 4 of the teachers to be on a panel in September at our pre-service faculty convening. The first panelist talked in depth about Teachers Pay Teachers because this educator is a power user. So we learned more about why it's so attractive to teachers. It helps them fill curriculum gaps, save some time, and it helps them have a work-life balance. Our second panelist talked about using OER to differentiate in world languages. Our third panelist talked about how they center student voices in curriculum. And our fourth panelist talked and demonstrated how they create OER, and that includes student-created OER to help meet Oregon's ethnic studies, Indigenous studies, and genocide Holocaust studies mandates. So in both the focus group and the panel, in addition to what I've already talked about, we learned overall that teachers are interested in learning about and using OER. Well, thank you, that's nice. They're wanting to do more for their students. But the other reality is that teachers, as we know, are generally underpaid and asked to do unpaid work, especially in their first few years of being a teacher. So one of our panelists said this: I wonder how we use OER and also not fall complicit in doing so much uncompensated labor. It may feel like contributing to OER just enables a system to continue where teachers are given one curriculum, but then have to work to create another on unpaid time. So that duality is something that our initiative will have to continue to address. And now I will bring Jen up.
Great. Yeah, my name is Jennifer Lantrip, and I'm a health sciences student success librarian at Pacific University in Oregon. And so, based upon what we learned from the literature review and the focus groups, we made a plan to support pre-service faculty for OER in their course redesign for equity. And so it included three main pieces. So those were OER suggestions for their course redesign, a convening and ongoing support. So I'm going to talk about them. So the first one was we provided sent for OER for the pre-service faculty, we sent them OER suggestions for their course redesign. And so we looked at the registration form that they had completed when they signed up for the convening. And we selected OER that would help meet their OER redesign goals, their course redesign goals that they had mentioned. And so we sent those to them just a month over before the convening. And so basically, at the same time that we sent that to them, we sent them an invitation for one-on-one support so that they could actually contact us by Zoom or email for support before the convening. And then we also connected with them with the OER point person at their institution. So Open Oregon Educational Resources has OER point people at each public institution of higher education. And so we were copying those people on the email just to connect everyone for that communication. So then for the convening, we had this convening via Zoom during fall term, or actually just before fall term started. And our primary goal was to build community in order for the participants to learn from each other, and then also to build that capacity for like collaboration afterwards. And then our secondary goal were for all the participants to reach a shared understanding of high quality course design. And so basically that course materials should be relevant, aligned with course outcomes, accessible, designed with an equity lens. And then finally, we wanted to provide training on equity-minded teaching practices and OER course design. So, and then the last thing is on this slide, you can see it says, how can I make my course 10% better? We didn't want to overwhelm them. And so we wanted to communicate the message that they should just focus on reasonable, attainable, achievable goals in their course design. So they didn't have to redesign everything to make it perfect, but we wanted them to think of in terms of how can I make it 10% better? And because course redesign is an iterative process, so in small changes can make a big difference. So here is the agenda, and we really structured our agenda to focus on the community building and learning from pre-service teachers and practitioner teachers. And then we also wanted to focus on give time for hands-on time and discussion. And so we have some links to the resources on this slide, so I would encourage you to visit those. There are videos of some of the presentations and the slides and the materials that we use, so you're welcome to access those and use those. So basically, we just started with an introduction of the grant goals and deliverables, so they understood that. And next, we had expert pre-service faculty, Amber Hoy and Kelly Arisp, who have created the Pathways Project, which we mentioned a little earlier, for pre-service teachers at Boise State University. And so they presented on how to scaffold instruction about OER for equity for pre-service teachers. And then they gave transferable takeaways for the attendees. And so I would really encourage you to also check out their project and their resources. And we have links to their resources in our slides. Then next we had someone from the Oregon Department of Education talk about our OER Learning Commons Hub there. So it's the Oregon Open Learning Hub, and it's for K through 12 teachers. So he talked about that. And then as Kim mentioned earlier, we had our panel of practitioner teachers in Oregon who currently use OER. And so they just provided some really inspiring examples for the attendees about how they are currently using it in their classrooms and then the difference it makes for their students and also for them. And then after lunch, we had hands-on time for discussion. And so I'll talk a little bit about what we did in that, but basically we wanted to give them time to really see an example and then think about what they might do about that. And then in the conclusion, we asked them to talk about to think about, I used to think, now I think. And I'll go into their answers for that because they're kind of cool. So for the hands-on time, we wanted to provide them with like basically an idea so they could think about what they might do and just really give them a concrete example of like what it might look like to redesign their course or part of their course with an equity lens. And so we had an example that one of the pre-service faculty in Oregon had actually created for a different grant. And so we showed that to them. They got time to just review it. And then they had the option of like joining a discussion about implications for their own course or actually just taking some quiet time to think about it for themselves. And then we'll talk about some of the lessons that we learned from our convening. So just with our format and our time frame, we really decided to focus on community building, hearing from the experts and people that are currently doing this work, and then at hands-on time and discussion. So to accommodate this, we just provided follow-up materials for equity-minded course design and OER, and as I'll talk about future like kind of ongoing supports for them. And then here are some of the things that they talked about for that prompt. I used to think, now I think. So these are kind of fun to read. I used to think that OER was just about textbooks. Now I think it can include activities and lesson plans. I used to think that OER was for students to use. Now I see it can be for students to contribute to. I used to think OER essentially meant using free textbooks of variable quality. Now I think it can go in all kinds of directions. I used to think OER was overwhelming. Now I think it feels more approachable. I used to think OER was just for higher ed. Now I think it has many possibilities in K-12. I used to think you had to redesign an entire class. Now I see I can focus on a module or a lesson. And then the last one, I used to think I wasn't using OER because I wasn't familiar. Now I think my practice is aligned. And I'm interested in contributing, so it's exciting. And a couple other things from our discussion at the very end that these things emerged. So one was the need for a single OER for pre-service faculty. So any takers, anyone want to create this or create or adapt it? So basically, so the need is for scaffolding, teaching OER for equity for pre-service teachers. And so currently we have quite a few sources. Again, they're linked from the slides so you can see what we were drawing on, but we have OER for teaching pre-service faculty, and then we have some other OER that are really focused on like, are there resources that are really focused on like the teaching, like for like with equity lens, with like, transparent teaching, UDL, culturally responsive teaching, and open pedagogy, right? So we have those, they're all in different places. So it would be great if we had one where it was really like showing that scaffolding of faculty, like from like modeling the use of OER to like having them like go find, evaluate, and then eventually create and share. So we found out that was a need. Another one was the other discussion point was just this theme of like this kind of like thinking about how to respect teachers' time and also inspire them to do OER, right? Okay, so and then like the idea that kind of the people were talking about was advocating for a shift from state funding to pay from textbook companies to paying, and respecting teachers' times to adapt and create and share OER. And finally, we made this list of resources that we shared with pre-service faculty so they could be supported in their course design. So this is the one I was talking about, where it's kind of this compilation of all these awesome resources, but it would be great to have them together in one place. And then finally, we have these ongoing supports for them to help them throughout, because they have, like, they should be designing this all this year, redesigning their course. So basically we can support them one-on-one via email or Zoom. We have monthly Zoom drop-ins for community and support. We have our Open Oregon Google group that they're welcome to join. And then they have their point people at their institutions. We have a potential speaker series, and we also have our summer convening. So first of all, I know you may have questions, but we have questions for you. So what I wanted to ask is, if in person with your neighbors or on Zoom, in the chat, if you could talk about these questions. So question number 1, do you see connections to your local context? Number 2, what opportunities or barriers would you encounter if you tried to adapt this model? And number 3, who or what resources could be supportive to this work in your local context? Thank you. And
3 minutes.
and you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
I'm sorry, the host is muted.
Thank you so much. I recently connected with Barbara sits in Washington, our third neighbor, and really exciting stuff is happening there. And maybe Barbara, if you want to like chime in on the chat if you haven't already. And I really recommend taking a look at what they're doing. They're way ahead of Oregon, and I'm hoping that we'll be able to learn from our neighbors in Washington. Do we have a good Zoom question? Not yet? Okay. Go ahead.
Just to draw a little bit, you shared, I'm really especially interested in how language arts is sort of approaching this. And one of the things you mentioned was student selected or student led choices when teachers were talking about that. Can you talk a little bit more about how students were, when they were sharing what they were already doing, how were students making choices and leading what was in the curriculum?
Do you want to take that, Kim?
There's a couple of different examples, and I don't know that any of the examples from our focus group or panel were specific to language arts, but my colleagues can correct me if they're remembering something specific from language arts. So I think the biggest example from sort of our Power OER user and creator, the one person in our focus group who then was on the panel, they integrate student created materials for around ethnic studies, indigenous studies, and the genocide Holocaust studies mandates. But we also had another panelist and focus group member who has worked a lot in the juvenile justice system and really incorporates their students' perspectives and lived experiences in making curriculum decisions as much as they have control over them, and really trying to make it incredibly student focused. But I don't really have any specific language arts examples. Any other questions? Oh, yeah.
So this is amazing. I love everything that you're doing, and I look forward to any publications you have about the reporting of it after this, hopefully.
Noted.
Okay. What I wanted to ask was, so Abby Elder, I'm from Iowa State University. I see a lot of connections with this sort of thing in our local context. We've supported from some faculty to develop faculty, pre-service faculty, yeah, in supporting their pre-service teachers. And one thing we've done is done open pedagogy projects with pre-service teachers to develop lesson plans that they can take with them when they become teachers after they graduate. That's one way to sort of bridge that gap, is to build it into a project that they're already doing for higher ed. And it might help to do that because you have more money to give when you're in the higher ed context and you're supporting students and you're supporting faculty than you might have once they are teachers, sadly. One question I had is, do you see any other opportunities besides that to sort of build out more of the instruction as they're getting ready to go into the teaching realm, besides the things that you've already brought up, or other ideas like that?
I want to re-recommend the Pathways Project folks, and you look like you're familiar with them. I mean, they have done such a beautiful job of integrating this open education piece into the entire program. So it's not just like, oh, in one course about technology, you were maybe exposed to the idea of OER. It's like really deeply integrated, and the role is really well developed of the pre-service teachers throughout their entire program. And one thing that I also wanted to sort of a thread that I wanted to pull out in what you said is that even though you might be learning about OER and developing OER while you're in your program, you might be in a classroom with a situation where like it's not going to come up, or it's not maybe your practitioner teacher who's supervising you has like different learning objectives or different lesson plans or whatever it may be. So we also recognize that our pre-service teachers might not end up practicing using OER until they get into their own classroom. And that's also okay, right? We want to like really be aware of like setting people up for success, not trying to like send them into their pre-service classroom where they're going to have some clash with the teacher that's already in the room, right? So that's sort of another piece of it, and another piece of K-12 being like this other like complex environment that's very different from higher ed. So hopefully that sort of gets at some of the pieces of your really good question. Thank you. Do we have anything from Zoom yet, Elizabeth? Sharing resources in the chat. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Okay.
So my question's sort of similar to the question about whether or not any school districts had started to support this. I'm in higher ed, and we always point to, faculty can get paid for creating open things, like find these grants, find universities that are helping pay, tag along on some other project if your university doesn't pay. Are there places where, now you have this grant, but are you aware of others that we might be able to point K-12 teachers to for that question or that statement you
Yeah,
showed from the
right.
panelists at the beginning?
Right. So I'm not familiar with any school districts in Oregon doing this. However, there one project that I was doing with the Oregon Education Association, which again is a union, we were paying stipends to educators to be part of a learning community where they produced ethnic studies lesson plans. Also within Oregon, as part of the Department of Education, there are 10 what they call regional educator networks across the state that focus on professional learning, and they have been funding that work as well.
Do we have another question for our last 2 minutes, Jennifer?
Hi, my name's Jennifer Jordan, and I am from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And so in New Mexico, the public education department dictates what can be used in public schools, and teachers don't have a lot of choice. They're often kind of like infantilized by the state. How are you able to collaborate with the Oregon Public Education Department to grow OER?
I would say that there's a lot of work that needs to happen in Oregon as well with that. But as Jen mentioned, there is a branch of the Oregon Department of Education that has an open learning repository, and they are doing OER work in that way. But I would say it's not incredibly developed. Yeah. Elizabeth.
It's not necessarily a question, but I kind of just wanted to possibly touch upon that because I'm also an Oregonian. So when I was in my undergraduate, I think this was like my junior, maybe my senior year, but I actually had a professor that I believe used an opportunity to have students work on a publishing opportunity directly talking about ethnic studies in Oregon and the importance of having OER. And so I can somehow, some way try and find that. But it was a really impactful thing to really help advance ethnic studies through an open education lens and higher education specifically, while also touching upon the K-12 system. So just a note.
Thanks. And I would also add that in the Pathways project, they really are focusing on ancillary materials. And that's also something I think that we got from the focus groups, right? Really just that, like, okay, that can be used to supplement existing materials maybe that teachers have to use. So yes, that basically like that's really like, if I had to say like the highlight of their project is really like how much power those ancillaries can have for those teachers. So
Thank you all so much for coming.
Thanks, everybody, for coming. This concludes our program.
I had seen it, so eventually it's made, it's even was it, I'm so excited to see what you're doing. But I think our project, like, we aren't working with the faculty say, hey, here's my teach this kind of thing. And then working. Yeah, that was great. It was a fascinating part, like really. You meet real fun in the Minnesota States. Is there somebody you're there? Sit on like, absolutely. They just meet kids. I'm sure. It's, well, I mean, it's stuff, but it's not, I don't know that it's like, so the reason I bring this up is because I don't know, there's but I've seen it music so it sounds like what this allows. So just say there's a textbook that they have to use.